in order to just survive and keep moving forward are secure. But the focus is going to very quickly, I think, after that, switch back to data privacy as some of these new regulations start coming into effect again. Let's see, make sure I'm on the right slide here. There we go. So most of you guys know me. I am an MVP. As Brigitte said, I work very closely with the Iowa user groups, Iowa SQLSaturday. I am the regional mentor for this region, which is Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. Happy to do all I can for the community, and I was very sad that was not able to come up to Madison for SQL Saturday this year, but hopefully next year we'll see what happens. If you have any questions as we go through this, because I'm going to throw a lot of information at you guys, feel free to interrupt and ask questions. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and let me know. I'm happy to talk through it and answer questions directly. You can also throw questions in the queue, and we'll see if we can get to those right after the presentation. But yeah, don't hesitate to interrupt. And you can also feel free to get a hold of me at any of these places after the session. Also, I'm always happy to talk to you. All right. So you can't really talk about data privacy without actually getting a little bit into cybersecurity. We're not going to talk a lot about it, but basically there are three different models of cybersecurity. There's traditional cybersecurity, what most people think of when you're talking about security. And this is designed to protect the company. You're keeping attackers away from data that they're not supposed to get to. You're keeping them away out of your systems so that they can't plant malware or can't take over the systems or do whatever they're going to do. That's all benefiting the company. You also have compliance, and most of us are familiar with compliance. If you have any sort of regulation, such as HIPAA, which I know is very big in a lot of the circles in Madison. If you are a public company and you have SOX, if you have any other sort of regulation, there's all sorts of them, then you're dealing with compliance. Compliance is not the same thing in cybersecurity. Compliance is primarily there to satisfy the regulators, whether that be an actual legal regulator like the US government, or whether you're talking about a contractual regulation for a business partner. Or even there's even some other voluntary regulation or compliance that you can do. But that is there to satisfy some sort of regulator, internal, external, legal, contractual, voluntary, whatever. The third area is data privacy. Data privacy is there to protect your customers. Really, the rest of the stuff that we're doing really doesn't do much to protect the customers. But the data privacy itself is the piece that we've been really missing in cybersecurity, the piece that's there to protect the customers, the employees, the people, not just the company and its systems. With data privacy, we're talking about protecting the people. And so as we're talking about this, there's really these three main spheres, and people think of them like this, where they're separate, they're very distinct spheres of influence. Really, though, it's a lot more like this. The three models of cybersecurity have a significant amount of overlap. There's a lot of pieces that you will do for one that will apply to the others as well. There are some attacks which will hit more than one of these spheres. There are still some that will fall only into one, but most of them will fall into the intersection area in that Venn diagram. That's part of what makes it so complex, but it also makes it a little bit easier for you, because now by doing one thing, you can satisfy some of your compliance, you can satisfy some of your security, and you can satisfy data privacy. And really, that's what we're looking for, and that's a great thing when you can do that. When you hear stories about data privacy in the media, it's frequently talked about like this is a new problem, like this is something that's just come out of the blue over the last couple of years. It's really not, though. If you jump back to the early days of my career, 30 years ago, data was traditionally bought and sold like commodities, and this has been going on for decades. If you think about the old catalog ordering companies, all of those mail order companies, when you placed an order with them, they didn't just fulfill your order. They would also take that data, that list they compiled, and they would sell it to somebody else. This was a second stream of revenue for a lot of these companies. When you register your car at the DMV, when you give your driver's license information, when you one that still happens is when you register to vote, when you go out and you buy a house. All of this information is treated like it's public information. In case of government, it actually is public information by law. But for a lot of this, it's treated like public information in a lot of ways. Companies also tended to hoard this and treat it like their own data. When you gave them your name and your address and your phone number, that, as far as most companies are concerned, is their information then. They have it in their database, and therefore it's their information to sell and to recompile, to do anything they want to with it. So you've got corporations, you've got mailing lists, you've got the data brokers, you've got your profiles like on Facebook, like on Google, and some of these catalog ordering companies. And there's the data brokers will sometimes compile their own profiles of you. Government will have information on you that is frequently sold. The credit bureaus are probably the most famous example of this, where they will compile a great deal of information on you, a massive profile. They can't by law sell that information wholesale anymore, but there's a lot of companies that will get information from the credit bureaus if you're applying for credit in some ways. That's the reason you get all those credit card offers in the mail, is because they got a list from the credit bureau. Media companies. Media companies used to be famous for this. I used to work for Gazette Communications, which is the parent company of the Gazette here in Cedar Rapids. They would sell their subscriber lists. They would buy other lists from other companies in order to bolster their subscriber lists. It's a very, very hot commodity. It's still going on today, a little bit more limited in scope, but it still goes on today, and it probably will for quite some time. But we're looking at the beginning of the change on this. For years, they've started to create varying laws to cover a section of this. Many people know about HIPAA, which is the primary law the law that most people know about that covers health insurance information. But you also have Sarbanes-Oxley, which contains provisions for privacy or data security. Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which passed back in the 1990s, dealt with financial data. Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. That is the law that prevents somebody from company from collecting information on anybody under 13. You've got a patchwork of data breach notification laws. Every state in the United States currently has some sort of data breach notification law, which simply requires that if a company's database is hacked or is compromised in some way, then they have to send you a notification that, hey, by the way, we lost your data, sorry. Those vary a lot from state to state. There's a lot of states that have them, but they're not exactly what you would call strong. They're very, very weak laws. What constitutes a data breach, what constitutes a piece of data, actually varies a lot from state to state. There are some in which you have to have several pieces of information in order to qualify as a data breach. Some places it's only one piece. So it's very, very very, very broad. One of the first pieces of what you might consider modern or approaching modern data privacy legislation is the 1995 Data Protection Directive in Europe. And this was still a lot weaker than what we see today. But it was really the first stab at saying, okay, the information belongs to people. We need to protect the information for people, and how do we do that? And how do we get companies to kind of rein this in a little bit? But this was also at the very early days of the internet. We didn't have the problems we have now with data breaches. We can't transfer large amounts of information at the speed of light like we can now. And so things have changed. One of the pieces of legislation from Europe was the Safe Harbor Treaty. And part of what the Safe Harbor Treaty did was allow data exchange between Europe with the Data Protection Directive and the United States. And this was groundbreaking in a lot of ways, because nothing had been attempted like that before. But it also, one of the provisions of Safe Harbor also attempted to apply the Data Protection Directive to the US, kind of going around the normal laws in the US. Not very much, but it did start down that road. The one thing all of this has in common is that the definition of personally identifiable information, regardless of which one of these laws you're talking about, HIPAA being one of the notable exceptions, was very limited in scope. For the most part, it was only if they could piece together enough information to get down to a single person. So your name, your address, perhaps your phone number, all of this had to come together in order to be able to identify a single person, or like your name plus your email address. If it was only a single piece of information or one of these specific pieces was omitted, it didn't qualify as a data breach. They didn't have to tell you about it. And penalties were limited. It's basically a slap on the wrist from a lot of these older laws. Yeah, there's fines and such that come out of this. Yeah, they can add up, but for the most part, it was no problem for a lot of companies to just pay the fine and move on and not actually have to change their business practices. But as we have been seeing over the last several years, probably the last 10 years now, there have been more and more and more frequent and severe data breaches, both aided by internal people and that are purely external in nature, where they are exploiting some sort of vulnerability to gain access. I mentioned internals because the current statistic is that somewhere around 60% of data breaches, sometimes depending on which study you look at, sometimes it's higher, but 60% is kind of where the number has landed, that are aided in one way or another by an internal person. A lot of times this is inadvertent. It is a laptop that's lost. It's a spreadsheet that accidentally gets emailed out. It is malware or phishing. But it does involve an internal person. The reaction to all of these data breaches, the reaction to people's new awareness of just how much data is out there on them in the wild and being traded between companies, has caused a backlash. And that's caused the legislators, the regulators to sit up and take notice and really start to do something about this. And that's really pushing things toward privacy. And how can we rein this in and make it so that people's data seems to belong to them again? So as a result of this, requirements are starting to change very rapidly. In the last few years, there have been definitely at least 3 major pieces of legislation that affect people in the United States. There are a number of others that are not as widely known, are not as widespread, that do still affect you in the United States. But there's three major ones that you really need to know about. If you satisfy these, chances are you're going to satisfy most of those that are out there. Those three are the GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and the New York Shield Act. And we're going to talk in detail about all three of these. And more is coming. 107 countries currently have some sort of data privacy legislation. None of them, or only a handful of them at this point, go as far as the GDPR. None of them surpass the GDPR. That's kind of the standard at this point. But 107 countries have some sort of legislation on the books that affects the data privacy of their residents, and more are considering it. There's a tidal wave of this type of regulation that is coming, that is being considered by the various governments around the world. I believe Brazil is one of the ones that's on the list that has one of the stronger regulations. Australia and New Zealand, I know, are on the list. I'm trying to think of a few of the others, and they're not coming to me right now. But there are a number of these that are either on the books right now or are coming, that are really going to have some strict regulation behind them. In the US, all 50 states have some sort of data privacy legislation on the books. Most of them are relatively weak. As I said, they're data breach notification. They're not true data privacy, which implies active protection of the information, not just, oh, we got hit, we lost this data, and now we have to tell you about it. There are several states that are considering enhancements. However, all of this has created a patchwork of regulation in the US as far as data privacy goes. The existing laws on the books are inconsistent. In many cases, they're contradictory. So what one state considers to be a data breach, another state does not. In this case, you have to notify. In this case, you don't. There's penalties on this state. There's no penalties for it in this state. There's a lot of contradictions. And so there have been weak attempts in past years, but the last couple of years have been some significant attempts at federal legislation to resolve this patchwork and be able to simplify compliance for companies across the country and around the world. A few of those that have been proposed and not passed are the Consent Act, which was a 2018 bill, I believe, that would have created a national opt-in requirement. Right now, companies, you've probably noticed, can automatically check the box for you, or they just don't even allow you the ability to opt out of a given newsletter or a given piece of marketing, or the ability for you to opt out of them sharing data. The Consent Act would have required that businesses make all of that opt-in, so that you have to give an affirmative consent to using that data. That one failed. It actually died in committee. This past winter, there were two bills proposed, and again, neither of them made it out of committee. One was the Consumer Online Privacy Rights Act, which was a Democratic bill. The other was a Consumer Data Privacy Act, which was a Republican bill. There were certain things that these bills had in common. Both of them were aiming to resolve this patchwork of legislation and to enact a federal regulation. The Democratic bill was much more consumer focused, consumer friendly, much closer to GDPR. The Consumer Data Privacy Act was a little bit more business friendly, a little bit more status quo. Still forward, but not nearly as far. Some cities have even gotten in on this in an attempt to increase the strength of the laws in their area. New York City is one of those that has passed a regulation that applies only within New York City, applying to their residents, called NYC Secure. You're going to see more and more of this as we move forward. This is what the map looks like today. As you can see, the red states are those that actually have data privacy, not just data breach, but data privacy legislation on the books. And there's only 3 states so far. California's is the one that is really the most well-known. Maine and Nevada both have weaker laws on the books. They're basically enhancements of what they had previously, but they are definitely a step forward. I don't know a lot about either one of those. Washington and Maryland are 2 states that really have moved it forward and are getting close. There's several states that have a bill in committee that has not passed. Wisconsin has had 3 in the last year or so that have died in committee. Iowa had one this year that died in committee. There's a few states that have created a task force. It's just a really big patchwork. But 2 years ago, this map would have been entirely gray. It just wasn't even consideration. All of this has happened within the last 24 months, and you're going to see a lot more of this going forward. GDPR, as I said, it's a General Data Protection Directive the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe. So why are we talking about a European law? The GDPR is important in the US because it is the first regulation of its kind that attempts to be global in scope. According to the text of the law, the GDPR affects all businesses, regardless of the business's location. Regardless, if you held data of any sort on a citizen of the European Union, regardless of where that person lives, regardless of where your business is located, regardless of whether you have a presence in the EU or not. If you have data on an EU citizen, then you are affected by the GDPR. And this is what a lot of companies in the US do not realize. The Privacy Shield Treaty, which is the successor to the Safe Harbor Treaty. The Privacy Shield Treaty applies the GDPR and makes it enforceable in the US. They have to go through US regulators. They can't directly come after you. The European regulators can't directly come after you. But the US regulators are bound to enforce the GDPR. We haven't, to my knowledge, we haven't seen any instances of it being enforced in the US yet, but it does affect us here. If somebody and this affects a lot of various data, we're going to see some more on that in a minute. But just a few examples is if somebody that from the EU has bought something on your website, has commented on your website, has an EU citizen that has come into your store here in the US on vacation, a person who has dual citizenship with the US and the EU, or who holds the US green card. Maybe they haven't been back to Europe for the last 20 years. None of this matters. If they are an EU citizen, this applies to you. The whole point here is, as I've said, is to return the control of the data to the individual and to take that control of certain pieces of data out of the hands of the company, so that that person has at least some say in how their data is handled. It's been effective for a little over 2 years now, and it's been wildly successful by their standards. One of the Okay, so they've got 7 different principles in the GDPR. I'm just going to try and pull up my notes here a little bit more. Some of these are pretty self-explanatory. So like lawfulness, fairness, transparency. You have to, they're going to hold you to doing things that are valid under the law. Transparency, that's pretty obvious. They're going to, you have to tell people what you're doing with that data. The purpose has to be limited. So you can't say anymore under the GDPR, well, we just want that data. We want to buy all these mailing lists just because. You can't hoard it anymore. You have to have a purpose under the GDPR, one of their valid purposes, in order to hold this data. You have to keep the amount of data that you hold to a minimum. You have to, and then you have to store this for only the length of time that you actually need it. Once your valid business purpose is finished, then you are expected to get rid of that data in one form or another, whether it is completely anonymizing it, whether it is decoupling it from the identity of the person when you no longer need that, whether it is purging that data completely. You are expected to get rid of the data that is no longer serving a valid business purpose. You're held to accuracy. So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I noticed that you have a record here listed in my data for a house that I've never lived at. You have to fix that now. You can't just push that under the rug and hope nobody notices. They have the right to ask for this data. They have the right to review this data, and they have the right to make you or to ask you to correct this data. And you have to comply. I see I have a friend in the room. You have to take steps in order to make a correction to this data, which you never had to before. You have to make sure that the data is processed even by third parties in a manner that ensures appropriate security. You have to protect it from damage under the law. You have to keep it confidential so that nobody that does not have a need to see this data, it can get to this data. You are accountable for this. They have the concept of what's called a data subject, and they have the concept of the data collector. The data subject is the person that the data describes, so you and me. The data collector is the company that is holds primary responsibility for it. But you also have data processors who are the third-party partners of yours, and the data collectors are fully accountable for all of the data, regardless of which third party may process or hold that data. They're responsible, and so that is different than what it has been in under any previous laws. This law has some very serious teeth. And this is something that is also a major change from what we have seen in the past. Just in the first year, and these stats are a little bit outdated. I need to go and get another copy of them. But just in the first year of enforcement, from May 2018 to May 2019, they issued the regulators that were actively pursuing GDPR requests handed out 360 million euros, which is, I believe, exchange rate on euro is about $1.50. 360 million euros in the first year alone. They had 200,000 investigations between the various regulators across Europe. Some of the notable notable, I think it was about 1,500 different fines that were levied, and just some of the major ones, some of the ones that you may have heard about. Google was fined over $56 million. Marriott suffered a data breach, $124 million fine. For a cyber attack, British Airways was fined $230 million. And it's not always the big headline ones. The British Airways one was actually one of the largest fines ever handed out. And that was for a cyber attack. They didn't hold really any responsibility for it happening, but they didn't stop it. They didn't do enough to stop it, was the decision of the regulators, and they should have. There was a Danish taxi company that was not purging data that was no longer relevant to them. They had a bunch of information that they had no business purpose for, and so they got fined 1.2 million kroners. There was a Portuguese hospital in which they had created some fictitious accounts to be able to get around security. That hospital was fined 400,000 euros. And then there was just a local business, storefront in Austria. They had closed caption TV security cameras pointed out at the street to capture the people coming into their store. They were fined 4,800 euros because somebody complained that they were passing by the store. They were caught on this camera, and the people didn't like it. They agreed with the person and said, no, there's no reason you need to capture that much of the sidewalk. And they fined them for 4,800 euros just for capturing images of people passing by on the street. The moral of the story is that damages are not necessarily required for you to run afoul of the GDPR. That's really, really important to know. It does not have to be a major data breach anymore. It does not have to be a major cyber attack. It does not have to be even necessarily negligence of what we in the US would normally consider to be negligent. It can be anything that causes somebody to feel like their privacy is being invaded by your collection of this data. Some of the impacts of the GDPR is a vastly expanded definition of PII. It is no longer just, as I said, the combination of your name and your address, or your email address and your account password. I thought I had a slide in here which actually went into detail on exactly what is covered by PII under the GDPR, but it is much larger than it ever was before under previous legislation. You are, as I mentioned, there is the expectation of direct protection of data now. You can't just say, well, we have a firewall up and that's good enough. We don't think anybody's going to get in. You actually are expected to be actively attempting to protect the integrity and the privacy of this data. To go along with that, there are new restrictions on where the data can be located. The DBAs have been hearing this more and more in recent years that, oh, well, we can't put that data there because it has to be located in Germany, or it has to be located in Australia. And laws like this are why. There's restrictions on viewing, there's restrictions on transmission across boundaries. That's where the safe harbor and the privacy shield treaties come in. There's restrictions on where that data can be stored. This is a big thing in Azure with geolocation or georeplication. You have to keep that data in certain cases close to where the subject of that data actually lives. I already mentioned that you have to have the transparency, you have to have the justification, you have to have explicit opt-in. There's a lot more websites that have a requirement for you to actually check that box now to say, yes, I confirm that you can use this data, or that I want this email newsletter. That came about because of the GDPR. And probably the most the biggest one that's going to affect people and hardest to comply with is that under the GDPR, the data subjects have the right to request deletion of their data. Now, this is not everything. There are certain pieces of information, such as a record of an order that they placed with you, such as a record of complaints. There are certain pieces, or if it's an employee, there are certain pieces of human resources information that you are allowed to keep on hand. It goes back to the justification. Do you need this information for any reason? There are many pieces of data that you're not necessarily considered to be critical business-related data anymore. You have, on request, you have to provide a comprehensive list of all of the pieces of information you have on a given person. You have 72 hours to produce that list. If they say that they want you to delete that data, then you have 72 hours to comply. If you do not, then you can be held liable under the GDPR. These are very serious things. I meant to mention back on the slide about the penalties for the GDPR. The maximum penalties for the GDPR are also much more serious than what had been in previous. I don't know where this slide went either, but the maximum penalties under the GDPR are 20 million euros, so about $30 million, or 4% of your global revenue, your global gross revenue for a given year, whichever is higher. This is where it comes in, where they are really trying to put teeth behind this, because no matter what your business is, that is not a slap on the wrist. They have the complete discretion about how much to fine you up to those limits, but 4% of your global gross revenue, I don't care who you are. You could be Google, you could be Microsoft, you could be Apple, you could be Facebook. You could have billions and billions of dollars in capital. That's going to hurt, and that's the whole point. They want these large companies that have been accused of abusing all of this data that they had to pay attention, and it's working. Okay. Flash forward a little ways, and you get to the California Consumer Privacy Act. This is the first legislation of the GDPR-style legislation in the United States. It was passed back about mid-year in 2019. It became effective as of January 1st of this year. It's enforceable now as of July 1st. Similar to the GDPR, it applies globally, but it applies to any business that does business with a California resident. So we're not even talking about citizens here. We're talking about people who live in the state of California. Anybody. So 45 million people out of 300 and some million people in the U.S. 350 million. Technically speaking, in order for this to apply, in order for CAPCA to apply, they have revenue thresholds, they have employee thresholds, they have thresholds of the number of records that you hold on people. And if you meet any of those three thresholds, then it directly applies to you. However, and this has not been tested in courts yet because the enforcement just started, even though many small businesses may technically be exempt, you may be subject to the regulations through partners, because those partners hold their business, or those large companies. If you do business with one of those large companies, they may hold you accountable, similar to the business associate agreements, the BAAs, for HIPAA. That's the way a lot of these regulations are getting filtered down to the smaller businesses. Under CAPCA, you have the right, they do not have the opt-in requirement that GDPR has. They do not have the right to deletion like GDPR has, but they do give people the right to opt out of the sale of personal information. You have the right to request all of the data that is being held on you. You have to include certain information in your privacy policies. And they also dramatically expanded the definition of personal data, which happens under CAPCA. And so this is, I believe this is not the full list. This is a fairly comprehensive list that I've been able to piece together. But if you look through this list, you'll notice a number of things that were never considered to be personal information before. Your purchasing history, your purchasing tendencies, a consumer profile. We talked about the profiles before. Browsing history, your search history. So anything that Google has compiled on you, you can request that they not sell that to anybody else now. Website activity, geolocation. So they can't use your IP address. They can't use take that back to a city and state or to a household like they used to be able to before and sell that information. Your employment history, if you were an employee of one of these affected companies. Your educational credentials, biometrics, so fingerprints, voice prints, retinal scans, your face for something like Face ID, your signature, and then some account numbers that they might hold on you. So insurance policies, and that goes for health insurance as well as any other insurance. Bank account numbers, credit card numbers, debit card numbers, physical descriptions, medical information, believe it or not, that was bought and sold in some cases. All of these pieces of information are individually now considered to be private and subject to your rights under CAPCA. And so here are the rights that you actually have under CAPCA. You have the right to know what personal data is being collected. You have the right to know whether your data is being sold, whether it's being handed off to a business partner, and to whom. Before, they didn't have to tell you who their business partners were. You have the right to opt out of the sale. You have the right to know what data they hold on you. And I misspoke earlier, they do have the right under CAPCA to request deletion of that data. Again, there are limits to this, but they have the right to ask you to delete their information. And you cannot discriminate. A business cannot discriminate against a person for exercising their rights under CAPCA. That's also different than it used to be. One of the biggest differences between CAPCA and other regulations of its kind is, in addition to the state regulators being able to file actions against the business for violations of CAPCA, a private individual can also sue you under CAPCA and bring action against you in court. And they do not have to have a breach in order to do that. If you, for example, refuse to give them access to your personal data, or you take too long to do it, if they request deletion and you don't do it, if they feel that you've discriminated against them in any way, shape, or form, if they feel your privacy policy isn't up to snuff, you can bring a court action against. They can bring a court action, including class action, against you under CAPCA. And there are stiff penalties for this. The civil suits that an individual can bring can have up to $750 per person, per record. When it says per incident here, it means per record that was lost in a data breach. $750 per record. If you think how many records you have on people, you can see how $750 fine really could potentially add up if somebody came in and stole your database, or the actual damages. It may be much, much higher if there were actual damages. If you intentionally ignore CAPTCHA and the court finds you, or the regulator finds you in violation of that, it could be $7,500 per violation. And then again, a violation is an individual record. We could see fines in the millions or billions of dollars theoretically under CAPTCHA. There is no limit in the law as far as I know. I do have a slide in here which kind of gives you a rough idea of the differences between CAPTCHA and the GDPR. There's a lot of similarities here. It's very much a GDPR style regulation. The third one here is the New York Shield Act. And the New York Shield Act really slipped under a lot of people's radars. This became effective March 21st of this year. It was described in one place, and I like this, described as a data breach law that imposes data security standards. That's the reason that you didn't see it highlighted in red on that map that I showed you earlier. But it does still add a lot of teeth to the existing data privacy law, and turns it into something of a data privacy law. It covers any business that holds data, not just owns the data, not just processes the data, but if you hold the data, if you buy a list, you're covered by the New York Shield Act. Business, again, just like CAPTCHA, just like GDPR, the location of the business is irrelevant. The resident can be, unlike in some of these laws, the resident can be anyone. It can be completely unrelated to your business, just somebody who happened to pop in on a list that you happen to still have on a server. It can be a customer, it can be an employee. There are no exceptions in the New York Shield Act for small businesses. They relax the rules for the businesses under 50 employees, but there's no exception. You're still expected to comply. A security breach is also defined here as unauthorized access, not just when somebody steals your data, but if somebody is suspected to have accessed the data, then you can be held liable as having a data breach. That's a lot more difficult to prove. It's a lot higher standard than we've seen before. I'm going to go into in a minute what we're talking about here, but it requires implementation of, quote, reasonable safeguards. And it explicitly specifies that you have to destroy information you no longer need for specific business purposes. Private information. Private information under New York Shield is also a lot stricter than it has been before. It's still not nearly as strict as CAPTCHA or the GDPR, but it is a lot more than most data breach laws. They have a distinction here between personal information and private information. Personal information is any information concerning a natural person, which can be used to identify the person. Private information is specified in the law, and you have to really meet one of two criteria. Either it has to be your full name or your first initial and last name, plus one of these 5 things: biometric information, social security number, driver's license number, state ID card number, or an account number. The second option is that it could be either an email address or a username plus some sort of way to access the account. So password, security question, or anything else you choose to use as the identifier for access. So you can't get around it by just saying, well, it's not a password, it's a security code, as some companies have tried to do. And you also can hold you liable under this if you just have an email address with no account security. I mentioned that they have different requirements under New York Shield. One is data breach notifications. This is still primarily a data breach notification act. You have to now report it both to the residents and to the authorities. And they specify, quote, in the most expedient time possible and without unreasonable delay. They don't specify a time period here. You're just expected to comply as soon as you know. Then they also have the data security program. And again, here they use broad language, reasonable administrative, technical, and physical security measures. So the definition here is vague on purpose. They do have a few things that you must include, but again, these broad. They're trying to capture the requirements for a lot of different people. The nice thing is on the New York Shield is that they do give you a pass if you comply with, for example, HIPAA. Even if you don't necessarily comply to the letter with, even if they don't comply to the letter with the regulations outlined in the New York Shield Act, if you comply with HIPAA, you meet the requirements for New York Shield. Same with SOC, same with Gramm-Leach-Bliley, all of these other regulations. If you comply with one, they assume that you comply with New York Shield. The penalties here are not nearly as stiff, $20 per notification up to $250,000, and they don't have a private right of action, unlike CAPCA. The last one I want to highlight is the Oregon Consumer Identity Theft Protection Act. It was significantly amended in 2019. There are further ones. That are proposed, I understand. It applies to any person that owns, maintains, or possesses personal information of Oregon residents. It's very similar to New York Shield in a lot of ways. It does add a couple of pieces of information related to your health insurance and your medical records that New York Shield does not, but the maximum fine is $25,000 per violation, and my understanding is that's broader. That's a data breach. It's not the individual record like under CAPCA. So there's a lot of new legislation. There's a lot of really significant things coming up. Know about these, learn about them, and there will be more of these coming. Okay, so we've got a lot of this legislation out. What do you do about it? I've run through a lot of the legislation, a lot of the basics behind data privacy. What do you do about all of this? Jumping back to the models of cybersecurity that I talked about right off the bat. You've got your compliance sphere, you've got your security sphere, you've got the privacy sphere, you've got the overlap between them. There is a lot of overlap, even more than what it shows in my little illustration here. There is a lot of overlap. By doing one, you're going to improve all, and that's really what it comes down to. You need to start. You need to do something. Get moving on all of this. If you don't have a cybersecurity program, get started on cybersecurity. If you're not compliant with anything right now, get started on that. Still pay attention to items that lie outside of the specific spheres, because those can be just as damaging. If you have something that falls under GDPR that's not really a cybersecurity thing, still make sure you pay attention to it, because that is still a very damaging, that can be very damaging. It can lead to significant fines. But start with the areas of overlap, because that's going to get you a long way. And to know what that is, look at some of the regulations that you have to comply with anyway. So if you have to comply with HIPAA, if your company does SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3, if you do ISO 27000, if you have to comply with PCI. PCI is a start, and a lot of that's credit card industry security standards. That gets you a long way. There's also a lot of U.S. government, other European government programs that you may have to comply with. Trustee is one of those voluntary programs. All of these are good. they all move the needle. There's hundreds of these various baselines and frameworks. The one I want to highlight for you is the Nist Cybersecurity framework. The Nist framework attempts to be comprehensive. It's designed to be foundational to all these other regulations that you may have to comply with. It's designed to be global. There's actually a number of countries that have specifically stated that this is their baseline, their framework that they're going to make everybody comply with. Nist has done it. That's the National Institute of Science and Technology. It's a U.S. government agency. They have a lot of information out there. They have best practices. They have some guidance to help you get started on this. Overall, it's very, very broad, very detailed, but overall, things fall into one of these 5 functional areas you see on the screen: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. It's designed to be a foundation. It's designed to get you a long way toward good, robust cybersecurity, and it happens to help a lot with data privacy as well. So once you have gotten at least a foundation of cybersecurity, if you're going to move forward on governance or on the privacy, one of the first things you'll want to do is governance and start down that road. Why governance? Because in order to really know what you need to secure as far as data privacy goes, because it's not just firewalls like we've had to deal with before. It's not just the pieces of information where it's not just securing your workstations. You have to really know what data you have in order to be able to secure it. That's a different mindset than what a lot of people have had for cybersecurity. So go down the road of data governance. Data governance tends to be process-oriented. It covers how you're handling all of this data. Usually you have to create some sort of governing body for this. But the reason for governance is that it allows you to understand the risk that you may have. Once you've got some basic data governance frameworks in place, then you're going to want to go to data discovery. And this is really where the pieces that benefit data privacy come into play. Under data discovery, you are going to take a look at all of the data that you have in every database. Most of the time with data discovery, you're also going to look at all the non-structured data that you have. So that could include Word documents, it could include spreadsheets, it could include your databases, it could include NoSQL databases that you have, emails. All of this information is valid data under these data privacy regulations. It doesn't have to be just what's in your SQL Server databases. You want to learn what data that you have, where it's stored, how it's stored, what the context is. And this benefits you for BI as well. That's where data discovery originally started. It's where a lot of people have heard about it from. But the same concepts apply to data privacy. And if you learn about it in one context, you can use it in the other contexts as well. Once you know what data that you have, then you're going to want to apply data classifications to that. And what a lot of people use as far as classification, as far as a foundation for classifications, is 3 pieces of information. What type of data is it? How sensitive or how confidential is this data? And then what's the value of this data? At the very least, if you go through the classification exercises, you want to know these 3 pieces of information, because that's what's going to really benefit you for data privacy. So is this like an identification number, or is this something like a comment from a website? And you want to have this documented. Is this data that is considered to be private, or is it public data that is from the public record? Because if a public record is lost, they're probably going to look on that a lot more lightly if that information is already out in the public record than if it's something that is like medical information that is supposed to be highly protected. And then they're going to base the fines on the value of this data. So definitely include those three. Microsoft has taken steps toward helping you with this, and they're not all the way there, but they do have some pieces out there for Azure that help you with this, called Advanced Data Security. Some of these have parallels internally as well. So those three components to Azure Advanced Data Security are data discovery and classification, vulnerability assessment, and advanced threat protection. With data discovery and classification, it's an automated scan. It will make suggestions for you as to what it thinks this data might be based primarily on the column names. They don't do a deep scan of the data itself, but based primarily on the column names. And they do process this with Azure machine learning, so that they're constantly improving their models and helping to make educated decisions about what type of data this might be, what classification it might be. It's not perfect by any means, but it's a start. And if you think about how many databases and how many tables with how many columns that you have, even in one application, let alone in your entire enterprise, automation like this is crucial. You can see that right up front, and you can export this result to Excel to be able to give to an auditor or something like that. Data discovery and classification is primarily thought of as an Azure tool. They do also have a version of that which applies to on-premises SQL Server databases, and they have talked about extending the Azure tool down to on-premises as well. I don't know if there's any movement on that at this point or not, but that is something that's been discussed. They also have a vulnerability assessment tool, and again, this is primarily an Azure tool, but they do have a version of it that you can run on premises through Management Studio. It's intended to be a one-click scan for security best practices. And again, this is kind of a baseline. It's a simplistic test, but it goes towards compliance. This is automatable, so you can run this through PowerShell now. It does provide suggestions on remediation for the violations that it finds. So like one of them might be that, hey, you shouldn't really be using SA, and here's how to disable SA. They derive these rules from analysis of databases that live in Azure. It's by no means comprehensive. You can add you'd have to obviously add your own experience into this and to know whether some of these apply to you or not, but it is at least a start again. And you can create your own base framework for using vulnerability assessments. So if there are some things that just don't apply to you, you can tell it not to scan for those. And then the third piece is the advanced threat protection itself, which is active monitoring. It's a true security scanner. It's looking at your SQL Server logs, which you can turn on Azure SQL database for anomalous activities. This can include SQL injection, which can be hard to diagnose otherwise. Again, this provides recommendations for mitigation for any of the vulnerabilities that it finds in your databases. It is integrated with Azure Security Center if you've got a security team which watches that tool constantly, and it's again scriptable. So if you're in Azure, those are good tools. There isn't anything really like that in AWS or Google, to my knowledge. If there is, it's very new. This is something that is limited to Azure at this point. So some more general practices besides the data governance that you'll want to do directly relating to privacy. One of those is row-level security. This goes back to some of the regulations we've talked about, where a person should not have access to data they don't actually need. The way row-level security is implemented in SQL Server is a programmability feature. They will tell you that there are ways that you can bypass this. You can make it go around it. But it is a programmability feature. It does work well. for what it's intended to do. It joins in a table valued function to determine whether a given row should be shown. And so you want to make sure that because it is joined in there in every query against that table, that it has to be a very, very fast function. You don't want to have to do 12 lookups in order to figure this out. Preferably just something that's a very quick little function to be able to make this determination, such as, is this person in the right department? Does this person have the right role? That sort of thing. The nice thing is it's fairly transparent. There's 3 pieces that you have to implement, so it's fairly easy to implement. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because there have been other presentations about it. It's something that's been out there for a few versions now, but it does work, and it can go toward that requirement for privacy. Data masking, dynamic data masking. It's another SQL Server security feature, or I should say programmability feature. Again, it's not intended for high security requirements, but it is very useful for doing some simplistic masking when it's something like a social security number, where you know that most people only need access to the last 4 digits to be able to see that. You can hide all or part of this. You can turn it on and off for specific people. The data in the database is not changed, so the data is available for processing, but you can hide it so that the average person doesn't see information that they don't really need to be able to see. And again, this can be applied to existing applications. It does require a schema change unlike row-level security, but it's pretty transparent, pretty easy to do. You can find static data masking tools out there. Static data masking is used in much different circumstances. This can be applied to pretty much any application you have. The static data masking is going to be more useful for like a DevOps scenario, like we'll talk about in a little while. Going a little bit more toward the theoretical or the conceptual ideas about what to do with for data privacy. When you're designing a new application, when you are evaluating new applications, design with least privilege in mind. Design with data privacy in mind. So when you're designing an application, use only the required permissions. So don't give people sysadmin. Don't even give people DB owner if you can avoid it. Get it down to that granular level, that lowest level. Don't give access to all tables with DB data reader when you can create a role that gets down to the granular level of what tables do people actually need access to. And most of these you'll see on the slides will have multiple benefits besides just the data privacy and complying with those regulations. Start with the end in mind. The GDPR specifically has the language that they expect everybody to be adopting privacy by design and default. And what this means in practical terms, in their actual legal terms, is that it's implied under the GDPR, or it's assumed that you're already doing this, that you have these policies in place, that you're doing the encryption you should be doing, that you should be taking the steps to secure the data via cybersecurity to prevent people from getting in, that you are including privacy as part of your system design or as part of your evaluation of a piece of software. They make all of these assumptions, whether they're right or not. And if you are not complying with these by design and default, you could be held liable. Because it's a lot harder to add privacy into an application after the fact. They want you to really have this be a first-class consideration when you're creating a system or modifying or buying a system. They also include the concept, and it's not written into it, but they include the concept that companies are no longer the owners of the data. The individual is the owner of their data. I own the name Ed Leighton-Dick. That's mine. It does not belong to the company that I'm doing business with. That's mine. I get to say what that company can do with that data. That company is now a steward of that data. And that's a very fine distinction in some ways, but it's very, very important that we start to realize this and adopt this, because that makes a lot of this clearer and a lot easier to push with your management. That we are the stewards of this data. We are taking care of it for people. It makes a lot more sense when you think about it that way. I also tell people to assume that more regulations are coming. They probably will. We're already seeing that. Again, nothing has surpassed the GDPR yet, but it's probably only a matter of time before somebody comes up with something to add on to that. Maybe Europe, maybe somebody else. Only collect what you need. So reduce the information that you have to track and protect. Why would you want to store this information or this mailing list of 1 million people if you only want 5,000 of them? Take in those 5,000 and get rid of the original list. Get it off of your systems. Get it out of your databases. Get it off of your network, out of your hands, so that you cannot be held liable for something. If you can't be liable for something if you don't have, that never existed. And for that reason, people use the concept of verify and not store. So, for example, if you need to verify a credit card number, or you need to verify somebody's real estate records, maybe you find a third-party service that holds that, and you use an API to just run a quick confirmation against that, and then you store the results of that check. Yep, that person does have that credit card number, not the data itself. You don't need that credit. Maybe you don't need that credit card number. You just have that third-party service that actually does your credit card processing. They have an API. They can check the number, and then you don't store that. And then it's something that you're not liable for because you don't have it. This also pays off in data storage savings because these are often going to take a lot less information than, or a lot less space in your database than holding all this information yourself. Be cautious about sharing. This seems kind of obvious, but make sure that you know what information you're sharing and with whom. Not only are you required to state it, but again, it comes down to what information you don't have, you can't be stolen, can't be lost, you can't be held liable for. So omit unnecessary information when you are sharing information with a third party. If they don't need access to the person's address, don't send them the address. If they don't need an exact birth date, give them an age, or even better yet, an age range. I'm between 45 and 54. If they don't need to know what my specific age or my birth date is, don't give it to them. Mask those ID numbers they don't need full access to. Mask a name in some cases, or anonymize the name. Or even don't even share the name if that business partner doesn't need access to a protected piece of information. Just don't send it. Anytime you deal with this data, regardless of how, whether it is designing a new system, whether it is deciding what to share with this partner, whether it's making a modification to this, changing your policy, any of this type of stuff. Anything you do regarding your data, make sure you're documenting it. Not just technical documentation either. Again, the regulations assume that you're already doing this. They're assuming this. It goes back to privacy by design and default. They are assuming that you have this detailed documentation and that you'll be able to provide it on demand. You don't have to go back and figure it out. You don't have to go back 12 different systems, that you have this documentation in hand and ready to produce at a moment's notice if you are asked for it. This also goes toward a good faith effort. In many cases, at this point, the regulators understand that this is a major change. They understand that it takes time for companies to go through their hundreds of databases and to and that there's going to be inaccuracies in the first attempt. They are going to be a little bit more tolerant as long as you are showing a good faith effort. With some of those GDPR fines for the data breach, for the cyber attack, there were major things that they missed, but the fines could have been much, much steeper. They were able to show that we tried. We still made a mistake, and the regulators still held them accountable for that mistake, but they were trying, they were doing the right things, they hadn't gone far enough, or they were in the process of doing something, and they were able to show that, yes, we made the good faith effort, it wasn't enough, we understand that, we're going to do better. Okay, we're gonna fine you, but we'll move on. Keep in mind that this data is sensitive, and you need to protect all of your sensitive data. Just like anything with cybersecurity, don't go for the minimum here. If it's sensitive to you, regardless of why, then you should be treating it the same way as you treat the things that are PII under these regulations. So a perfect example of this is for manufacturing companies, some sort of a trade secret. Trade secrets are a big business for hackers right now. Manufacturing has become a major target, specifically because they can do industrial espionage that the hackers can sell to somebody else. That data should probably be encrypted or protected some way. I've talked to a lot of manufacturing companies that have said, "Oh no, we don't need to do this because we don't have any customer data that complies." That's still sensitive. You still should worry about data privacy and take steps. Make sure that you are validating as close to the data as possible. Again, this goes toward that data not leaving the database. Don't let it go any further than it has to go. If it doesn't need to go to the web server, don't send it to the web server. Minimize exposure. This is the same thing. If it doesn't need to leave the database, don't let it leave the database. Don't make a copy of it just to make a copy of it, just to make it easier. If you do need to make a temporary copy, get rid of the temporary copy. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a database that has tables full of data that has been duplicated for one purpose or another, and it's left out there for weeks, months, years. Don't do that. Try to reduce the duplication. Try not to allow things to stay out there longer than it has a valid business purpose for. We already talked about privacy by design. Make sure that this influences all stages of your software development lifecycle. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about Agile, Scrum, Waterfall, a methodology of your own design. Include those checkpoints. Make sure that you're paying attention to how this data is flowing through all of your systems, through how it's flowing through the process. Know how, for example, the testing team is approaching data privacy. Have standards for them as well. Know how your developers are storing that. Are those developers copying that production data down onto their laptops for testing so that they can do it from home? Is some of this data even leaving your network and going onto home computers right now? It's a very real possibility as people are making adaptations for the pandemic. Know what's happening. Do risk assessments. Know what your third-party components are doing. Evaluate those. Ask the questions. In the database layer, pay attention to how you're constructing your procedures, your functions. What are you doing with this protected data? And minimize the direct queries from the application. Have that going through, that's the best practice anyway in many cases, but have it going through these procedures so that you can more easily control what's being done with that data. when you are putting together unit testing for those companies that are doing it, create a standard battery of tests that you use for privacy and security, just to go along with the functional testing that you're probably already doing. Create the standard one, expand it, continue, and roll this out across all of your tests throughout your DevOps lifecycle. DevOps can really help with all of this because now you can include those unit tests. They can happen every single time code is checked in. You can do the static code analysis. You can DevOps, just by its nature, tends to enforce these good habits that lead to data privacy. It also can go a long way toward helping you lock down your production environment. A lot of companies used to say, oh, well, we can't adopt a lot of this because our developers have to go in and they have to make modifications after hours. They have to fix bugs. If you're adopting DevOps, all of that goes away because now you're doing all of your development, all your testing in the lower stages of your DevOps process. And by the time it gets to production, it's gone through the stages. And in most cases, it's solid code. It doesn't necessarily, it's been tested thoroughly. It's against a number of scenarios. The developers don't need to actually get out there and touch production, and they can handle it through the process. And you can have all of these checks in there to make sure that it's being done. Source control your database. That goes along with DevOps, but not every company stores their database code in source control even today. If you don't already do that, consider doing it. It's a good first step toward doing a lot of these, taking a lot of these best practices. This one is one that is a passion project for me. Stop using production data for non-production purposes, please. If you at all can avoid it, please stop it. Find ways to anonymize that data. Within the last several years, there have been a number of tools that have come out to help you with this. Red Gates are probably the most well-known on this, but there are others out there as well. It is feasible to do it now. Find ways to use anonymized data or fictitious data, generated data, or at least masked data in those non-production environments. You can still test the scenarios. That was an excuse I used to hear all the time. Well, we can't accurately test scenarios. You can still find ways to test these scenarios. If you don't have the right data for a scenario, create it and add it to the suite for next time. But please stop duplicating the production data. You cannot comply with data privacy if you are duplicating this data all over the place. It just becomes a nightmare to try and do. Compliance is important. Build your auditing into any new system as you're creating it. Look for systems that have it built in if you're buying a system. If you're modifying, have the auditing at that point. Don't use it as an excuse that, well, we don't have time. Make time. Take the time to do these things. Don't wait for somebody to come after you with a Gdpr action, because by then it's far, far too late. And then finally, exhaustively, after all of this stuff, make sure that you're using the auditing methods available to you. And SQL Server has a number of them, everything from triggers to extended events and SQL Server audit. There's also third-party tools out there. A lot of those back off of these, but there are also some that use other methods to be able to capture the audits of what's going on. There is a Chinese proverb that I've heard used a lot recently that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. And I believe that this applies to data privacy as well, along with all cybersecurity. If you haven't started these efforts, pick something, and then pick something else. Iterate again, iterate again. It's going to be it's a massive effort. Any sort of cybersecurity is an ongoing massive effort. Start somewhere. You'll still be better off than you were yesterday. make a plan, check your results, update your plan, and repeat. Get to a better place than you were yesterday. Does anybody have any questions? Do we have anything in the queue, Bridget?
There was one question in there. I think you may have already covered it, though. Going back to GDPR, does GDPR apply to all U.S. businesses that might interact with data of EU citizens?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of U.S. companies don't understand this. They don't realize this because it is a European law, and for the most part, European law doesn't apply to the U.S. if you're here. But this one does. It is enforceable. So yes, it absolutely applies to U.S. businesses. And keep in mind that you may have, there's a lot of immigrants. There's a lot of people that are visiting the country. A lot of businesses do business every day with people that are just visiting the U.S. Or may have a green card. They may have somebody that works for them that has a green card, or some sort of other visa. That makes the GDPR apply to you as well. So yes, absolutely.
Basically, that means that the chart you showed or the map you showed, like GDPR applies everywhere. Like every business should act like this is the law everywhere. Like this is a worldwide law now. So
I believe that you should. I believe that you should, just to be safe. It might never come. It might never actually hit you directly. But if you wait until it's proven that you are subject to it, then it's probably too late, because there's companies that have taken years to work toward compliance with the GDPR, and they're still not there. It could be a massive effort to get there. So yeah, assume that it does, unless you can prove that it does not. That's what I'm advising people to do.
We had another question that just came in. So is there any instances of these regulations affecting government agencies which manage and collect personal data?
That is a really good question. I don't know. I imagine there are some, but I have not seen any descriptions of that in the major media, or the media that I subscribe to, or the blog posts that I've read. I haven't ever seen anybody address that directly. So I don't know the answer to that.
Cool.
If somebody finds out, though, I would love to know. Please let me know.
Does anyone have?
I have another question.
Oh. Yep,
yeah,
shoot.
Okay. So there are companies like called wealth screening companies. Does this basically put them out of business? Like, because their job is to like collect all sorts of info so they can figure out who's rich and then sell it to nonprofits so that they can ask those people for money. And so like a nonprofit might send all of their names to this wealth screening company, and the wealth screening company sends back like this person we think has between this and this amount of like total wealth, this and this amount of like property wealth, like, and then they'll like categorize them, like that sort of thing. Is that like something that can exist now under this law?
Yes, it can. It certainly can. Keep in mind that the data privacy laws are not intended, as you said, to put all of these companies out of business, because there's very valid reasons for most of these to exist. Somebody needs that information. What they're intended to do is just to give the average person a say in how this is used. So yeah, you might end up with 10% of the people, or probably not even that high, 1% of the people that subscribe to a given website that say, no, you can't use my data for that purpose. But you still have the other 99% that are okay with it, because most people understand that when you go to that website, that it's not necessarily free. And a lot of times you want this type of thing. To use your example, these wealthy donors want to be able to be found. They want to do philanthropy. Many of them do. There may be a percentage that don't, but many of them do. Many of them would be fine with this being used. Some of that information may come off of public records. Might you have a little less accuracy? Possibly. Might it be a little less comprehensive? Yes. Does that mean it can't exist? No. It just means that the person has to have a say in whether it exists and how it's used and how it's propagated to other companies. Does that make sense?
It does. It's just that I doubt that like these rich people know that they're in this database that's being sold around. Like, and I don't know how they got the info. Probably a lot of it is like public records, like where you bought a house is a public record and stuff. So I don't know. It's just, I'm pretty sure that the aggregation of it would make a lot of those people clutch their proverbial pearls. So I don't know. I mean, I don't feel like there's like a clear, like that sort of data aggregation. I don't feel like there's a clear line between, yes, I consent to giving you this information and that being incorporated into a profile of you that's being sold so people can ask you for money. It's just like,
I think
but I mean,
I think you're absolutely right.
I think your answer is right. I just think that probably that's going to be maybe the next thing, you know, to tackle somehow via some sort of regulation.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's definitely more regulation coming one way or another. Some of it may frankly be sorted out in the courts. GDPR is a very long law. I want to say there's like 700 pages to it, something like that. Maybe I might even be remembering too low on that. It's a very, very, very large law. But even so, it's still very broad in terms of the way it's written. Kafka's the same way. It's very broad. There is a lot being left to interpretation by the regulators, by the courts. And even under GDPR, even as many times as regulators have brought up actions under the GDPR, there's still a lot we don't know about exactly how it's going to be enforced. It's still working its way through. There's still a lot of things that are not settled by it. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of things that we don't know for a very long time on a lot of these because it is such a massive shift from what we've had before. So yeah, definitely. Great comment.
Thanks.
Anybody else have any comments, any questions that I can answer? As I said, feel free to get a hold of me if you think of anything later, either through Brigitte or directly to my email address or my blog or Twitter or something. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you again for having me. I definitely appreciate the opportunity to talk to you tonight, and stay safe.